Thank you for joining me. How's your day going?
It's going well. Thanks for having me on the show.
Did you get your morning run in?
I did. I did.
What's a normal morning run look like to you?
Um, I would say 4, 5, 6 days a week is just easy, anywhere from 30 to probably 50 minutes, maybe an hour. And then 1 or 2 days a week, I try to do something either harder or longer. So one day, maybe, interval workout on the track or hill repeats, or Saturday or Sunday going, a little bit longer. And a bit depends on where I am in a particular training cycle. But that's sort of my status quo week is, a number of sort of easy days and then 1 or 2 hard efforts. When I was younger, it used to be like 3 hard efforts in a week, but my body can't handle that anymore. So
do you have a pace you like to keep during those, like, I guess, normal days for you?
I am unfortunately guilty of running too hard on my easy days, a major issue for a lot of runners. So I really try to make those as easy as possible. But I'm anywhere, I don't know, 7-minute pace to 7:30.
Yeah.
I try to stay in that range. So
You get competitive with yourself running sometimes.
I do. It's just so ingrained. Like it almost feels more comfortable to run at that pace than a slower pace. I think just my body has done it for so many years. It's sometimes harder to go slower. But
no, I think I know what you mean by that. Sometimes when I'm going too slow, I feel like pain on my knees and my ankles is coming more frequent than when I'm running fast. But I want to dive into a few different topics here. And I first heard about what y'all were doing at Tracksmith as producing the Legacy of Speed podcast series that has just been released, I think 2 weeks ago.
Yep.
So I want to go into that story. What is the Legacy of Speed podcast about?
So it's really it's a really interesting and somewhat in-depth story. The sort of image that everyone will recognize is from the 1968 Olympics. John Carlos and Tommy Smith on the podium stand with their fists raised in the air with black gloves. Tommy won that race and John Carlos was third. And that image is one of the most iconic images probably of our generation in terms of sports go. But the backstory to it is what's really interesting. And there were a few different aspects of it that really intrigued me as I started to research it. And so the podcast explores some of those things. And so Speed City was the nickname given to the San Jose State track and field team. Starting in late 50s, but really the early 60s is when they started having athletes setting world records and sort of dominating competition. And it just became a school where a lot of the fastest athletes in the world were developed. And so they got the nickname Speed City. John Carlos and Tommy Smith, as well as Lee Evans, all on the same team, which is kind of unique that this San Jose State was not an athletics powerhouse. It was really kind of a tiny commuter school in Northern California. And they end up with, multiple Olympians. Lee Evans and Tommy Smith both won gold medals and John Carlos bronze. So it's just sort of an incredible period of time, and all sort of orchestrated by this legendary coaching figure named Bud Winter. And so the podcast sort of explores how San Jose State became a powerhouse of speed, but what Bud's techniques were, why they were different than what existed previously, and then sort of how the dynamic of the coach and a few of the athletes on the team, including Harry Edwards, sort of led to this protest at the 1968 Olympic Games.
What were some of the things leading up, I guess, starting in the 50s, where Bud and San Jose State started to get this reputation? How are they getting the athletes? How were they starting to create that nickname Speed City?
Yeah, so Bud Winter was, he trained Air Force pilots. And the story is really interesting. He was a big believer in this idea of relaxation for peak performance, which at the time was counterintuitive to what everyone was told. It was all sort of grit your teeth and, push as hard as you can, sort of maximum effort. And so he had this amazing experience with fighter pilots. And then when he got to San Jose State, he applied the same concept to his sprinters. And he thought, well, if I can get them to relax while running at top speed, they will perform better. And sure enough, he created what is now, everyone sort of knows this. And sometimes you see it in races, sometimes you don't. Sometimes it's still hard to relax when you're running at top speed. So he basically recruited some athletes in the 50s and started applying these techniques. And the 1960 Olympics in Rome, he had an athlete, Ray Norton, who was the best in the world, almost certainly would have won 1 or 2 gold medals at those Olympics, but right before the Olympics had a freak injury and wasn't able to perform. And so the experiment of Speed City sort of failed in 60 in the sense that they thought they were going to achieve this amazing feat, and then they didn't. But they just went back to work and continued to develop the athletes and the training. And sure enough, in 68, they sort of had their moment on that Olympic stage.
Sure enough. And as you kind of mentioned, right, I can picture that image of, I think it was Tommy and John standing on the podium with a black glove on their hand, raising it during the ceremony. And I never really knew what led up to that. I just knew it was like silent protest during the 68 Olympics. What were some of the events leading up to that? The relationship with Bud, the relationship with the team that kind of made that happen or like pushed them to do that?
So it's, there was a couple of factors at play. What one was just this: sports does provide an incredible platform, a global platform. And the 68 Olympics, I think, I need to fact check this, but I think 68 Olympics were the first ones that were broadcast in color on TV. It was also in Mexico City. So from a time zone perspective, almost everything was live in the US. And so you just had this moment in time from a cultural perspective where a lot of people were tuned in to this event. And so there was a platform that existed. There was also, at the time, the civil rights movement, and Harry Edwards is sort of the link to this all. Harry Edwards was a discus thrower on the San Jose State team. And he was actually one of the only athletes that sort of had any tension with Bud Winter. He became a social advocate on the college campus. He felt that the Black athletes were treated differently than other athletes. In the first episode explores a little bit, and maybe second episode explores a little bit, sort of, the housing of the athletes, and they tell the story that there was these sort of like lists of houses, but when the Black athletes would go and ask to stay there, suddenly they were full or there was no availability. And, so they're living, a lot of guys in a single house. And so he became sort of one of the first critics of the way athletes, and particularly Black athletes on this campus were treated. And he ended up leaving the team. He actually didn't compete all 4 years because of his disagreements with Bud Winter. And he became a very important sort of member of a movement to protest the 68 Olympics. And there was a meeting. The athletes were all involved, and they had several meetings leading up to it. And they in the end decided to take a vote. And a little bit before the 68 Olympics, they voted not to boycott the Olympics. But what they agreed to do is find their own ways to sort of protest the treatment that was happening back home. And so, a lot of people at the time were advocating for the boycott. And in hindsight, it probably was, probably going to the Olympics has had a much stronger impact than boycotting the Olympics, because we had that moment. So if that moment didn't happen with Tommy Smith and John Carlos, and Lee Evans also had a protest on the victory stand, those moments spark conversation and dialogue. And so actually going to the Olympics, winning, and then using that platform to protest actually, is what sort of started more of the conversation. So just this sort of unique factor of a couple different variables and events that led to that moment that we all know today.
Were these meetings just at San Jose State to boycott the Olympics, or were they athletes overall?
Overall, yeah, no, it was all over. And in one of the episodes, we interviewed one of the athletes that was involved. It was actually in New York City, and Dr. Martin Luther King was there. There were some other very recognizable figures there. So they were meeting multiple all over the place and had multiple meetings. It was not just track and field. It was all athletes, all sports, and it was also sort of political and social justice figures as well that were involved.
What was their reception kind of directly following the protest, like once they got back to the United States?
Unfortunately, it's quite sad. They were ostracized. I know Tommy Smith's story a little bit better than John Carlos's, just because I worked at Puma for a period of time, and Tommy Smith has been a Puma athlete and ambassador for since back then. He was running in Puma in the late 60s. They were not treated well. It's some of the same conversations 50 years later we have today with someone like Colin Kaepernick. There's one side that thinks it's disrespectful, another side that thinks it's the right thing to do, and it's conversations that need to be had. So it was very similar. They were not treated to a warm reception when they came back, but I think with time and hindsight, there's been things done to sort of try to rectify the situation. There's a statue of them at San Jose State. I believe there's also a statue of them in Mexico City now. And so there's been some things that have been done to recognize how important and impactful that protest was.
Yeah, very much so. And your relationship with running and connection with running, I think starts from kind of your beginning, but you were able to pitch this to Malcolm Gladwell, who, when I was looking him up, I didn't know how well of a runner or how good of a runner he was actually. Yeah. But you got him as the main narrator of this, right?
Yep.
How did you pitch this story to him, or how'd you get in touch with him?
Yeah. So I got to know Malcolm. He was a customer. Someone texted me one day and said, I just ran by Malcolm and he was wearing Tracksmith. And so I looked it up, and sure enough, he had bought something. And so I reached out to him to just introduce myself, and obviously have a bond over running. He is, he's still running and competing now, but when he was younger, he was a very good runner in his sort of teens and early 20s, a middle distance runner, mostly the 1500 was his main event, the mile. So, we got to know one another. We've done a little bit of storytelling about Malcolm, and likewise, he has helped us with a few things. He wrote and narrated TV commercial that we ran during the Olympic trials, track and field trials leading up to the Tokyo Olympics. So we've just had a great sort of both professional and personal relationship. And I knew that he, revisionist history obviously is podcast that is one of the most listened to podcasts of all time. He explores these really interesting stories, and I kind of would always say, hey, what do you think about this one from a running perspective? And he always sort of said, well, the audience would be too small. It needs to be such a compelling story that it can sort of cross over to a non-running audience as well. And so I just kept at it, and sort of then the time came where we were putting the pieces together for this Speed City project, which we're actually doing also in conjunction with Puma, because of Puma's connection with Tommy Smith and sort of their involvement in the sport as well. And so then when we went back to Malcolm and said, hey, what about this story? He was very interested. The piece of the story that is, there's so many parts of it that are compelling, but I think the one that Malcolm also got really excited about, because he just didn't know about it, was the connection between Speed City and Bud Winter and Jamaican sprint dominance that we see today, because some of the athletes that Bud Winter coached were Jamaican, went back to the island, brought the techniques there.
Wow.
And Usain Bolt's coach was actually in the audience of a seminar that Bud Winter was speaking at I think it was actually in the 60s or 70s. And he was very young at the time, probably only 18, 19 years old. And he later became Usain Bolt's coach. And, if there's some modern athlete we know that exemplifies relax and win, it's Usain Bolt. So Malcolm was really interested in that. He's of Jamaican heritage. And so that he didn't know that part of the story. And so he really went down the rabbit hole of that a little bit. So yeah, it was just sort of a couple different things coming together. And from our perspective, the running connection makes it really appealing. But then Malcolm's an incredible storyteller, as we all know. So
I mean, you couldn't really have picked a better synergy or
Yeah.
person to tell this story over the 6 episodes. Who knows what comes from there. But you mentioned Tracksmith, which is your company, and that's how you found Malcolm. 2014 is when you launched Tracksmith. Where were you in your life, and like what took you to take off and like start your own journey as an apparel running brand?
Yeah. So I had worked in the running. So just before that, I was at Puma. I was there really during Usain Bolt's sort of rise, actually, to prominence, which was amazing time to be there.
Yeah, for real.
Front row seat to that, I was very fortunate. And I sort of was at a period in my life and career where I felt like I was ready to take that jump. I had a startup when I was very young, probably 23 or 4, that didn't really go anywhere. And so I sort of drifted for a while trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to do. And then, started back focused on running specifically and, getting some various experiences around storytelling and brand marketing and sports marketing. And then I went to Puma. I was the head of global marketing for the running and training categories while I was there. And then sort of got to a point where I was ready to, take the leap and try to start something on my own. And that was actually in 2012 is when I left Puma, and it took me 2 years to actually get the brand launched. But I thought it would be a year, and it was twice as long. But yeah, eventually got launched in 2014.
Was this something you had thought about for a long time? I mean, I know your history of running. It sounds like I said at the beginning, you've done it since you were young. Have you always kind of thought, hey, maybe this is something I want to pursue?
I knew I've always been entrepreneurial. I've kind of grew up in a family of entrepreneurs. My mom had always run her own little country store and was an interior designer and ran her own business. My dad, almost forced entrepreneurship. He worked in the steel mills in Pittsburgh, which, over a period of a decade sort of continued to close, and sort of you bounced from one to another, and eventually it was all gone. And so he sort of started helping my mom building furniture and doing some other things. Eventually went back to a normal job. But so it was, I just grew up around that. And my brother is also, my older brother is also extremely entrepreneurial. He's does woodworking and craftsmanship down in Asheville, North Carolina. And so I kind of knew from an early age, like I really liked that. It was stressful sometimes to watch the ups and downs of a family business, but I also knew that it was something I really wanted to do. And so I did try early in my career after college, and it didn't go great. But then I just sort of went back at it and sort of continued to gain as much experience as I could. And what I really learned probably in my late 20s was running was where I wanted to be. I had worked in sort of more broad sports marketing across some other sports and media and different things, but ultimately knew I wanted to be in running. And so I really looked at the entire running industry. So it was never, I didn't ever go into it thinking I was going to start an apparel brand. I went into it thinking I'm going to start a running brand. I looked at media and technology, and yes, apparel and footwear and accessories, events, and just sort of through that process of seeing what was out there, where I thought opportunities were, it sort of became pretty apparent pretty quickly to me that men's apparel was an area in the market where I thought we could come in relatively quickly and establish a brand that felt distinct from everything else that was on the market. And then from there, use that to sort of continue to grow and evolve within the running category.
How do you describe like the look and the feel of Tracksmith and like what you go for?
I mean, it's a very timeless
Mm-hmm.
aesthetic. I think it's often easy for people to use words like vintage or retro. That's actually not at all the way we think about it. We do have a line of products that is, I would say, sort of inspired by the past, our Van Cortlandt collection. So that's an obvious one. But the rest of the product is just it's very timeless and classic from an aesthetic perspective, because when back in, the mid 2000, up to 2010, basically, and really until we launched, running apparel, and especially men's running apparel, was very, very bright and neon. And it looked like nothing else you had in your closet. It was a way to dress that you didn't dress doing anything else, which I always found very weird. And so, there's a color approach to that. There's a construction approach and a design approach to it that, has allowed us to create again, a cleaner aesthetic, a simpler aesthetic, something that you can wear for a run, but also feel comfortable walking around in afterwards. Doesn't look like you just came from a run. So that's sort of the aesthetic approach.
Yeah, you just said it. When I looked at your site and looked at some of your gear, it's clean, which I love. Like I love that clean look. You've been able to grow, I mean, a lot, right, over the years. How many current, I maybe say like Olympians or
Mm.
people trying to get to the Olympics are running or wearing Tracksmith?
Yeah. So that's so
I've heard some big numbers. Like,
it
yeah.
is, but there's a little bit of a caveat to it. So, traditional sports marketing and running is, you sign an athlete to a contract, they wear your gear, you sort of cross your fingers and hope that they get to that level, right? The only time running has a lot of visibility is at the Olympics, maybe World Championships, but really it's the Olympics. But there's a handful of athletes that make a good living in running, and there's a lot of athletes that just scrape by. But to try to get those athletes that are going to make Olympic teams can be very expensive. And so we had no interest in sponsoring athletes in that traditional way. And then leading up to the 2020, what would have been the 2020 Olympics,
Mhm.
obviously got postponed. In February of 2020, was the Olympic marathon trials. So for the marathon team specifically that would represent the US at the Olympics, they run that race separately from the track and field trials, and it's done well in advance so the athletes have time to recover. So that was done in February, just before COVID. And leading up to that race, we actually had a few employees who had either qualified for the trials or were trying to qualify for the trials, as well as a lot of friends and people in the Tracksmith community. And so we just said, hey, is there a way that we can support these athletes with not a lot? We're a small company. We don't have the budgets of these other brands, but what can we do? And so we came up with a program, at the time it's called the OTQ program, Olympic Trials Qualifier. We provided them a quarterly gear stipend. So basically didn't have to worry about getting any of the gear. We also partnered with a coffee company and a nutrition company, so they could also get quarterly shipments of coffee and nutritional supplements. And the program started with 10 people. And then the next big marathon that happened, a lot of people ended up getting the standard to compete in the trials. And so the number doubled, and then it just kept going and going and going. And by the time we got to Atlanta for the Olympic marathon trials, we ended up having, I want to say 130 some athletes out of 500 on the starting line at those trials. And the nuance here is that this is also, we don't make footwear. And so at the time, there was this marathon shoe that Nike had developed that gave people an advantage. It was a better performing shoe, and the other brands hadn't quite caught up to it. And so we were the brand coming in where you could get all the apparel needs met, but you were allowed to wear whatever footwear you wanted because we weren't
Cool.
dictating that they had to wear our shoes because we didn't have shoes. So there's a little bit of a nuance there. So anyway, but it was great. We ended up with a ton of athletes in the program. It's very well received. And so we decided to then kind of evolve it for the track and field trials. And we changed the name to the ASP program, the Amateur Support Program. And basically similar thing, you could apply if you either had the standard or were close to getting the standard. You could be in the program, and we opened it up to all events. So not just the distance events, but the sprints and the jumps and hurdles and throws. And obviously the Olympics and the Olympic trials were postponed. But last year, 2021 Olympic trials, we had, I want to say 35 athletes actually competing at the trials, 5 of whom made the Olympic team. So we had 5 athletes end up going to the Olympics who wore Tracksmith in the trials. Of all of the big brands that Nike, Adidas, Asics, Brooks, Saucony, Hoka, On, all of those brands, we were, I think, one of only 2 brands that had athletes in every single discipline. So every, javelin thrower, jumper, sprinter, every event. And again, ended up with 5 athletes at the Olympics. And we just literally last weekend was the US championships for this year. The world championships are hosted in Eugene, Oregon. And so we extended the program a year, and I just got back from there yesterday. We had 40 some athletes competing, and 4 of them made the world championships team. So
Amazing.
Yeah. It's been really fun.
For you, that's gotta be almost like you're like living out a dream right now a little bit.
It really was. I mean, Eugene last year at those Olympic trials, I think it was the first night or second night. We had our first Olympian, and I, to be honest, going into it, I didn't think we would. It was outside shot for a few athletes, and to end up with 5, it was just such a great experience. And again, it's not a lot of support because it's all that we can offer and provide at this stage of our trajectory. But the athletes that were in the program really like it, because in track and field, when you leave college, you don't often get that sense of team anymore. And a lot of times you're on your own as a professional or trying to be a professional track and field athlete. And so to feel like you're a part of a community and a team, and we had a hospitality house out there, and so the athletes could just come through all day, get food, massage, recovery, hang out with other people. It was really special. So
very cool. What are some of the bigger teams in, I guess, the running industry when you get out of college?
So what's kind of happened over the last few years is it used to be that the brands would sponsor individual athletes. And what's happened, a little bit of a shift that's happened, is now the brands are sponsoring teams, and then the athletes join those teams. And by joining the team, you are part of that brand. So some of the big ones there's a Nike team out in Portland called the Bowerman Track Club. They have had probably the most success in recent years. There's a Hoka team in Flagstaff, Arizona, that focuses mostly on marathon and distance running. In the sprints and jumps, there's a few different teams as well. We actually ended up in the ASP program, had a number of athletes from the Phoenix Track Club, which specializes in the hurdles. One of their athletes actually finished 5th in the final, which was an amazing result. So it's different than a lot of the other pro sports that people know, and it can often be a struggle for the athletes to try to make it. There's a Puma team down in that just started down in North Carolina, for example, and so that's kind of more where things are headed. These sort of teams supported by a running shoe brand, basically, is how they form.
Nice. What did you have aspirations or dreams of making it to the Olympics when you were growing up?
Oh, yeah, of course. That doesn't every
What
kid
were
does.
your top events?
I just never, I never got close to that. But no, I mean, I think I actually growing up I loved baseball and basketball. I actually thought those would be my sports. And then as time went on, just sort of realized I was better at running than those, and fortunate enough to be able to run in college. And I always thought I would potentially get to the Olympic trials in my event, which was the steeplechase, but never quite qualified. So
that's a cool event.
Yeah. It's really fun. It's really fun.
I had Gabby Jennings on. She actually went to
Mm.
Furman here, and she I think is on the Boss team.
Yep. Yep.
And she was a steeplechase runner. I think
Yeah.
she's
Yeah.
got a bright future, I believe.
Yeah. She ran great. I don't remember exactly what place she finished. But she was at the US championships. Her teammate won. Emma Coburn is one of
There
the,
you go. Yeah,
yeah.
she's a big one.
Yeah. She's the best American steeplechaser of all time, men and women. She's
How,
had an incredible career.
how have you seen the relationships with these Olympians, these, individuals going to trials translate to like your overall growth at Tracksmith?
It's hard to, sports marketing, it's really hard to measure an ROI on sports marketing. But I do think that when we looked at the business from those trials in Atlanta all the way through to Eugene last year, there was definitely a bump in the business. Was it directly related to that? No, not entirely, but it certainly was one of the factors. It is more awareness. It's more visibility. The other thing is oftentimes in sports like running, you know, someone that is a runner becomes a resource for people who want to run. So it's, it's the classic, like, oh, I want to run a marathon. And, back in pre-COVID, when we all worked in an office, it was like, oh, go talk to, go talk to her. She's run marathons. And then that person becomes by virtue sort of becomes an ambassador and a word of mouth, sort of vehicle for whatever products, services, or whatever that they use and they like. And so I think now that we've had all these athletes, get to this level, when they go back home in their communities, they're very well known and respected in their communities. And so they become a little bit of a little bit of source of word of mouth for us as well.
Yeah. And sometimes that's the best part of marketing, right? Or getting it out there. The word of mouth is for you. What does your daily routine look like? I know you run a lot. I know you're probably pretty concentrated on your nutrition and your hydration. Do you have certain things that you try and do every day to keep up your performance?
Yeah. My day is, the one part of my day that I try to keep sacred is my morning. I usually get up just before 6. And I'm usually out the door 10 minutes after 6. And I run and, come back and eat a healthy breakfast. That's literally like pretty much 7 days a week. That is my morning. Once I get past that, it's just so unpredictable. I have 2 young kids, and obviously running a startup, once your day gets going, it can get away from you. But that's the one thing I've tried to keep. And then the other is sleep. On the other end of it, I always was sort of an 8-hour a night sleeper. It's now I'm more like 7 to 8 if I'm lucky, but I really try to keep that sacred as well. And won't stay up late just to stay up late. So those are the 2 things that I've been able to sort of control. My nutrition, when I was in college, I was so into sports nutrition, reading Nancy Clark's books, taking supplements, and, waking up in the middle of the night to eat an apple to keep my metabolism going overnight. I was deep into that. And then I completely stopped. I I drink plenty of water, I eat healthy, I sleep, and I get out the door in the morning. And that's good enough for me at this point.
Yeah. The 2 things you mentioned, movement and sleep, are probably, they're the top of the list. They should be the top of the list for almost everybody.
Yep.
With Tracksmith moving forward, do you have any goals? What are some of your goals? Where do you see Tracksmith in 10 years? What are you trying to achieve as a brand?
Yeah, I hope, I would hope in 10 years that it looks and feels the same as it does today. I have no desire to move outside of running. For example, a lot of brands start in, one sport and they sort of can branch out into others, but we want to stay super focused on running. Where I think the opportunities are is to just sort of, continue to expand beyond what we offer today. So not just product offering, but also geography. E-commerce is interesting because you can literally be a global brand the day you turn your website on, which we are, but we, predominant audience is in the US, but we still have a pretty significant international customer base. And so we'll take a couple steps in the next 2 years, over the course of the next 2 years, to create more awareness outside of the US, make it easier for customers outside the US to buy the product, touch and feel the product in person, and things like that. So it's really just to continue to evolve the things that we're doing, but do it with more people, have more people be able to experience the brand in some way.
Yeah. If somebody was going to your site today, what are some of the staples that that you still love as the CEO and founder?
Yeah, there's a few products that it's really interesting when you work at a company like ours. You can tell really quickly what products are amazing because they're the ones that all the employees also have, and usually have in like 2 or 3 colorways. I would say still, if you had to say like singular best product, but also best product that anyone could wear, I would say the Brighton base layer. Obviously, we're heading into summertime. You don't really need a merino wool base layer, but for 9 months of the year, for a lot of people, or 8 months of the year, it's just an amazing product. It performs extremely well. It's super soft. We worked really hard. It's basically a seamless merino blend base layer. It doesn't stink because you can, it's merino wool, so you can wear it multiple days without having to wash it. We obviously made it intended for running, but a lot of our employees who also ski or hike or just otherwise are out in colder temperatures, it's just like, it's the staple. So that's the one product. The one I like the most is probably the Bislett pants, which were inspired by a pair of pants that a friend of mine made in the 1980s. But their brand never got off the ground. So they made like 300 pairs of these stirrup running pants with a tall zipper. They're amazing for wintertime. The stirrup basically like holds the bottom of the pant close to the ankle. So when it's like slushy and nasty outside, it just sort of like keeps it a bit tighter. Just has a really unique look to it. And so he still had a few pairs, and he gave me some before I started Tracksmith, and I ran in a pair that literally was 30 years old, and I ran in it all winter, and it was amazing. It was like putting on a piece of armor on your bottom half when you went out in the cold. And so we created that in the Bislett pants with modern materials, slightly modern fit and construction, but kept a lot of the original details.
And you do have men's and women's, right?
Correct. Yeah. We launched our women's line like 9 months after we launched the brand. We just started with men's because it was 2 of us, then 3 of us, limited resources, limited cash. We just wanted to sort of get the brand established. And so we launched with 1 accessory and 4 men's products, and then added to that. And then 9 months later, we introduced our women's line.
And you still keep a pretty small team, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's grown. We've had our biggest growth during COVID. I'd say we're at 30, probably 35-ish.
No, that's a lot.
At this point. Yeah.
And a lot of remote.
Yeah. We COVID definitely, accelerated that trend. We had some remote employees pre-COVID, but I would say, most of the people were in the Boston area, and then with COVID and everything, combination of hiring people, a few people that were in Boston wanted to, move, temporarily or permanently. And so now the team is pretty dispersed, and we're, managing fine with that arrangement.
Yeah, sure. I think it's, in some things, positives from COVID. That was one that I saw as well, being able to do things just like this. And Matt, I just want to thank you for joining me. This has been incredible. I mean, I've already listened to the first episode of the podcast, Legacy of Speed. I can't wait for the next 5. If people are listening, where can they get Tracksmith gear?
So mostly tracksmith.com. Most of our business is online. We do have 1 retail store in Boston, on Newbury Street. And we have a handful of wholesale partners in a few cities. So if you're down in Atlanta or New York or Minneapolis, San Francisco, your local running store may carry it. But most of it's sort of online and through our 1 store in Boston.
Awesome. And where can people listen to the podcast?
Really anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can, if it's on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and iHeartRadio and all those places. So Legacy of Speed, if you search in your preferred podcast platform, you should find it.